Hello everyone. To welcome Amakal. Henley translate by the story. By the story. To think sound of rain. Sound of rain. Subscribe to my channel and be sure the which country. Watching your watching this was not only the voyeurs, empires. It was the stage of hearts. In the shadow of thrones, in the shadow of thralls, Polofields, human beings, in order to love, and to be loved. Yet some loves defied the laws, religious codes, class divides, and political age. Their age. These loves were forbidden because they could shake empire. An empire forbidden. Kaplanentin forbidden. Abidden because they crossed boundaries that the people of their era in breeze. In the stupumate. In Kimantary, we will narrate Twerid, we will tweln Fortin love stories drawn from friend couriers is different than Ephrosin's centuries. In different centuries. Each one is real. Each one is documented. Each one is let us sing is without the memory. Let us set out together on this journey into the depths of time. Chapter 2. Cleopatra, Illupritra, Epon, Petziub. Act Isar, a passionate the heart of Tuo empires, Nurationo Egypt. In 40 to EC, in 40 AC, she was in the midst of a civil war. Cleopatra Satyra, who bore the title of Pharaoh, had been driven from the throne by her brother Ptolemyd Del, exiled from Alexandria. The young queen was only 1 year old, yet her intellect, her command of languages, and her privileges, placed her among those rare figures who earned the admiration of rulers far greater than herself ages. Across the ages. That year, a Roman arrived in Julius Caesar. Powerful general of the Rome. The gentleman was one of them. The greatest milliners the world ever produced. He was 52 years old, married, and Egypt, tending to Lisa. For his own ends, according to historical record, Cleopatra evaded the enemies waiting for her outside the palace, had herself a smuggled in's quarters, gins, ensailed, inside, gold, this bold and crave orders them, and creative entry ins, entrant int, Keyser. The relationship between the two leaders was not merely a personal bond. Alls. Clegg Eid, Pathra, Bader, Kaiser Reich power. Keyser depended on Egypt's wealth and grain. Yet this calculated partnership swiftly deepened in genuine intimacy. Ancient historians such as Plutarch's allowed visited in Indrians and monuments Herpini, and remained at her side for extended periods. In 47 BC, Cleopatra Thesi, Cleopatra Navy birthed Shiarian, Theterzarian, meaning Little Keyser. Little Keyser. Kaiser never formally acknowledged the child, but Cleopatra never concealed his paternity. This relationship caused a tremendous in Rome, and in Rome, Keyser was already married. His union with Calpurnia was ongoing. Moreover, Cleopatra was a foreigner and a queen at that. Roman society had such liaisons with foreign women as moral decadence. Keyser's opponents wielded this situation. Despite this, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome in 46 BC and hosted her as a guest. As the West, Cleopatra reigned in Rome for nearly 2 years, until Keyser's assassination. In March of 44 BC, on the date known as the Ides, Keyser was murdered by the Senate. Cleopatra was in Rome at the time. She returned swiftly to Egypt, carrying Keyser's child. His death changed everything. Filet change. A few years later, she would capture the attention of another Uramomo. Marquis Antonius. But that was the beginning of her in love, greater and more tragic still. The Willed to Witcher and history. In the wheel, turning point. This union, one of those rare moments in which civilizations intersected. Edict. Cataclysmed as an untested, as the personal was millennial. is forbidden, because moral codes, Rome's mas ins nicht mifid, bidos, insolidet. All forbade it. But that prohibition was not enough to either of them. Chapter 2:2 Cleopatra's son, Unius, for half the world narration after the assassination of Julius Caesar, Rome was once again plunged into civil conflict and a power struggle that would bring the Repliviant and Marcus Antonius and Octavian, who had the name Augustus. The name Augustus emerged as leaders of rival blocks. Untoned claimed East as domain, and in 41 BC summoned Cleopatra to a meeting in Tarsus. The summons was intended to negotiate that would buy financial support to Rome. Kaklam, Hurst Tulirina than its ancient vitens. Magnificence. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, wrote that Theanas Mudon since played Freyand on versions played on her fragrant herbs stroned her and herbs surrounded her and founded her, and the tendons surrounded her. The scene was sore. Seeker assured her abandoned Antonius sitting at a great banquet table. His relationship with Cleopatra became not merely a political alliance, but a deep and sanguinary bond. Together they spent the winter, Philist of debates and war plans. Three children born of this union. The twins Alexander, Helios, and then Clupnif of Antonius Antalia's first of us. But Antonius was also married first to Flavia, and after her death to Octavia, the sister of Octavian. This last Marion had been full-fledged as a political arrangement to maintain the balance between two powers. Yet Antonius left Octavia and Anthian alone to turned to Cleopatra's side. In Rome, this relationship Octavian declared that Antonius had fallen in the Egyptian queen in the east and had abandoned Roman values and had betrayed the interests of the Republic. The propaganda machine accelerated cleared trade, Strangerats all and dangerous on destroying Rome. This is storm that has not so powerful, was so powerful that even the ancient Roman poet Horace depicted Cleopatra in his verses as a threat to the empire. In 32 EC, and Tyrannis Sophius sept Alvanagnius Sturicius Duvulflit Octavia. This signified that a reckoning with Rome was now inevitable. A year later, in 31 BC, in vain the Battle of Actium, Octavian's fleet defeated the Cantonians of Cleotrapt and Cleopatra. Both fled to Egypt. The following year, Octavian years, and turned Alexandria. Marcus Antonius receiving the false report, the Cleopatra. Patra had died, fell upon his sword and died of his wound. A few days later, Ander ended her own life by the bite of a cobra or another poison. A question still historians still debate. To avoid being concaptured to Rome, both were appointees cives. Where this relationship proclaimed the greatest political blunder in history. One of its causes remains a question without a definitive answer. But answer. Perhaps both were true. Cleopatra and Antonius vacated a world empire and their own lives to each other, created one of history's most enduring legends. Chapter 3's Abelard, and Luis. The Cl of Maud, narration in the church determined to live. Then, as well, Paris was becoming an ever-growing center of thought. Schools, thought. New students, the Breaker students, for every corner of Europe. In this world, two names became symbols. In came symbols of a historical love, Pierre Abelard, and Heloise, Abelard, and Billard, and then the most brilliant, but in his age, in the debates, in Vleffy he was unrivaled. Students traveled from distant cities to Paris just to hear him. In the early Walden hundreds, he was upon a familiar. He was 37 years old, and had long since claimed his place among young Jerusalem's most respected scholars. Heloise was 17. One of the best educated young women of her time. She knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She could read and interpret texts. Her uncle Canon Fulbert was a canon sealed, was immensely proud of his isnu pains. He had given his niece, Abelard, moved into Fulbert's household in order. Hold the world accountable. This arrangement formed to occasional tradition of the era. Wealthy families would send their children to the Holdren, to their homes of leading scholars, into their homes. But within a short time, and student, a bond that soon opened the gates to passion as well. Abel, Bible's own account, words, and then books. Books were set aside, and tutoring sessions means transformed into love letters. Their relationship inevitably, canonically. Heloise became pregnant and her to Brittany. Care. There she gave birth to a true boy. They named him a name inspired by the astronautic instrument of the age, to legitimize the situation and protect Heloisa. 8 Malar, Lazer, Abilad, marriage to Fulbert. Heloise opposed the marriage. In the arguments she committed to her letters, she maintained that marriage would damage via batch haberge. A bit put pen and churchman, Lameth, and Rocklide. No legal bond. In the end, however, she yielded to Abelard's insistence. They married secretly in a small ceremony in Paris. Despite the agreement, Filbert began to disclose the marriage. How always, the marriage. Helwas refused, accept this, and denied it, because the marriage threatened Abelard's career. Fulbert was consumed with fury. One night, he entered Abelard's bedchamber with him men hand castrated. Disgust was kite Giumbucht, Grilla. Beer. Abelard to retired to a monastery in shame. He sent Hellas Poluis to the Count of Argenteuil. Both lived separate. Poems in the misnomer. The most love lidded into were written in this period. The letters Heloise composed remain masterpieces read to this day, for intellectual depthful as much as her emotions, her emotional intensity. She gave in them some pissings. No nonsense. but to her ocean to virtuosi. She did not conceal that she was dedicated to him, to God, Abelard, in time, retreated and theologialad Gulfern. Apart for many years. Abelard in Onland 42. At Haloi's request, all his bodies was moved, the Paraclete, convent, when Heloise died 22 years later. In Iscent 6:4, she was buried, by her own wish, in the same grave. Today shared tomb for both of them, but for both of them in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. This story has endured has across century, as Burr Central to Burroughs last centuries, at Temishiwilish and Stenkerlis courage. It was forbidden. It is because Thargids prohibited such a union. But perhaps the deeper prohibition was Heloise's own demand for Lioise, her emotion, and her freedom. Chapter 4. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan, a revolution of the Welalit in a way that Tinusted Ulin operated according to a rigid order. Harem. The harem was not merely a space where women lived. It was the political institution that shaped the future of the state. Sultans would be with concubines. Unions were not for love. They existed to ensure the dynasty. Dotes. No. Ancient Kim. No, a no Kongkongkan in history had ever become the legal wife of a sultan. Until Hurrem Sultan. Hurrem's origins are debated. But most historians hold the view that she was of Ukrainian or Polish, where her actual name is believed to have been Alexandra Lisaletska or Roxolana. She was most likely brought to, is said through our ways, Bisher Ray heirs, the slave trade. In the Palace Aram, she began the lowest rung and waited alongside Al-San Sultan's Alton's tension that shields. Yet, she was as noticed before long. Suleiman the Magnificent was one of the most powerful rulers of his age. In the West, he was known as Suleiman the Magnificent. In the Ottoman world, he bore the title Kanuni, the lawgiver. of law, architecture, and the arts. He was also a formidable military commander. Hurrem succeeded in catching his attention and smusent ismal sman when Paltkin interest he showed to no other. With Hurrem was no ordinary kin. She was intelligent. He was intelligent, eager to learn, liklu to lyrative, penwingically, aquatin, flaremoint, gifted at acquiring languages. She corresponded with Solinaman. She answers Permand with R and Dim Ocean. The intellectual and emotional between the two tweens of that times. Of the palace. Then something happened, had never been seen before. Suleiman emancipated Hurrem and married her by religious contract. This digent caused tremendous shock in the Ottoman palaces. The Janissaries were unsettled. European ambassadors reported the development with astonishment, curiosity. Some in the close circle, such as Ibrahim Pasha, viewed this relationship dangerous influence. Hurrem's rival Mahidevran entered into a struggle for power in order to pass or the rights of her son, Prince Mustafa. Over time, Hurrem transformed into not only Suleiman's wife, as most trust, hold advisor. When Slimmerman departed hearted on campaign, would write him long and detailed letters and amendments conveying palace dynamics, the attitudes of foreign ambassadors and developments within the state. These letters are preserved today in the Topkapı Inni's Sanson Stmindmushins cause. She commissioned mosques, cantons in convents in Tia, schools, and fountain in Splee. Built Istanbul, Mecca, and Jerusalem. This love endured for nearly years. Hurrem died 558. Suleiman 6 in 15666. 66. Besieging Nurbanu Sultan and sultans, Finan Uba Sultan, who followed the path Hurrem. This era is described. This era historians as the Sultanate of women. Hurrem did not merely clear the way for a concubine to become a sultan's wife. She fell Flunswam Helens and the flunks. This loves This love was forbidden. It broke a tradition of centuries. But this prohibition was the story not only between Elizabeth proverbially meant matic cholerical flyic Shave Anne Melon and Bolin ind Angren Calorie de Fans Melanguins Anguirand Ainsang and Cholerics then Choleric Meller Aichen Kolshing Menglik Toleric 16th century was a Catholic kingdom. The authority of the Potiav carried decisive weight over the political decisions of the elders of the English throne. Marriages could not be dissolved without the Pope's applause. This rule of Pope Litic, even typical alliances, and it was into this rid world that the routinely the encounter between Henry VIII and Boleyn, and all time one of the Lear figures. She had spent years in France, Auvergne, the port of life. Her flawless French, and the enervate her and wade aid, indeed. On her return to England, she entered the service of the Lord of the royal court. She is said to have been beautiful, yet said her ugliness of the time, our talilism hurt not her merely hurt her appearance, but hurt her intelligence, her selfishness. Mfo spoke. Henry Cesarioc wrote letters to Anne Boleyn, some of which are preserved to this day in the Vatican Library. Henry had been married for years to the Prince Spanish Catherine of Aragon, but Catherine in akin bin gave him a male heir, and Henry and then this Windinyan this pardoned man wish binyan and man binyan bulldozer desirous and perspeda manlier hedemodidal political. Henry petitioned Penn to have his marriage to Catherine invalid, and thus known as an annulment. Cliburn was the aunt of Charles V's and of Charles Ping of Spain, and Charles pressure Rome. Rome was decisive. Thus began the conflict between the state Henry of sorts of pre-E. For by the act of supremacy of a 34 Church of England. Church 4, the Church of England, and broke from Rome, and later supreme led, and of the Church of England. Historians this rupture as the beginning of the Reformations of Orind. Catherine Orsa divorce, mer mood per morsa. From the muid hath, from the palace, Catherine, outhran out. Catherine Lightjum, Ida, and Diane Dud, the Patates, and died in 36, In 1836. Henry and Anne Boleyn married secretly in Unfaith 3 in Thethan Nanif in 3033. At that time, and there at that time, that the same year happened. But this child was not the male heir Henry had expected. It was a girl. It was Isabel. Elizabeth, this child, who would one day be known as Queen Zibeth I, Ingtus I, Wilt, filled Henry with profound disappointment. And in the years that followed, Anne Boleyn fell into the St. Hela syndrome. Games. She was probably viewed some stance and thusum. Issues known that she wielded a powerful influence, and Helen held strong viewages in Palistrong and Thirtius on religion and politics. In 1336. In 1536, as Henry grew distant from her and Boleyn was arrested on archery and high treason. The overwhelming consensus of modern historians is that Turner's was largest were almost certainly Fat and Tate fabricated. On the Keith fabricated. On the 1936, on the Peen 1936, she was E6. She was executed at the Tower of London. Henry remarried 11 days after her execution. The legacy of this forbidden love was a change of religion. England's formation. The story of Anne Boleyn was a bitter testament to how far a woman could far a woman's house politics, and how three fricks that rise could be versed. Step 6. The real world. Seal. The real world reflection of Romeo and Juliet, and Kathy narrations Shakespeare's Romeo and Julio and Juliers and Muse. The world inch to memory as the world's most famous forbidden. Yet, very few people know. This story rests historical roots. Before Shakespeare committed the work to paper, and 25 and define and 9 and 44 and 925 and 4 and 96. This time 1596. Nes 96. This theme been treated in Italian literature for centuries. Luigi da Porto's novella of 1430 of the 1630. The expanded version, The Atame, by Matteo Bandello in Matteo Bandello and Fitzfloyan, and Subdilension in 854, and subsequently the English translation of these works, that is, Christine Sinster's Pranchen of Thirst, Shakespeare's principal sources. The authentic historical foundation points to Verona, two families named Montecchi and Campolecchi, Entinli 18th, Enfling 17th, at 18th centuries in Verona and surroundings, and Donri. And Dante Alighieri, in Diali Alighieri, in the work known as Purgatory, cited these two families as a concrete example of the political fragmentation and familial strife of his. Era. Dante composed these lines around the year 300, meaning these families were living figures of that time. Legend, the Veronese archives has, during the existence of a real Giulietta Calapilati and a Romeo Montecchi. Yeah. It is equally known that these documents does not prove the two shared a love story. This family of Renisandri had a genuine foundation in the political climate of medieval Italy. During this period, days of battles between two wide Colfalaux, known as Dameline, the Abeline. The Mani Mosaic family was thus identified as Ghibellines. That is, supporters of the error, while the Wamlia Wemphilea was known as Guelph, supporters of the Pope in Verona today. This structure is part of the cities. Every year, people stream to it from the four corners of the globe. They photograph Balstanilovs, Bithlukanapin of messages to the wall. To the wall. The question of real or legend or remains unanswered. But the question itself demonstrates the storing premins in human nations, in the human memory. Forbidden love surpasses the bounds of class and family enmity. Two people from opposing sides seek to overcome the enmity of their own families. This theme is universal because Faust adds it repeatedly. Urban fields and at borderlines, and the walls. Rival clans. The legend of the Verona is perhaps the crystallized culminant of hundreds of true stories that lived across the centuries, never reaching Ing's documentumum ord job curd chaptered. Chapter 7. Marie Curie, Harry A. and Paul Langevin, a forbidden passion in the world of science, of Science Nyong the Searing the year 19 Lishi, Mart Sathan Mart Zenith Abri Sinith of Marie Curie's career. She will never about to Rinsuin in Safri Gien 3 Vans and Physics and Mainty Mol 3 and Zun 3 and would win May Morse. When listen, this was an achievement out preachievement in the Hestinant, in the history of the noble, and at this very moment of triumph, add by that life's abridged, private life. Abridged. As last, in 1918 in Ianza 6, she was in mourning, yet she was indeed mourning, yet she continued her scientific work. In these years, she grew close to Bull Langevin, affair from her steer end, the one of the latest, that Langevin was married and was married. Was troubled. Some of the correspondence between the two scientists was seized by Langevin's wife and leaked to the press. The Frandwas news of a major scandal. Marie Curie was a foreign woman, a widow. In the world of science, each of these qualities constituted a spriti tuctit. Taya Paika of the time, nationalist and anti-Semitic amches. Humish launch theory. Some claimed she was Jewish, which was untrue. The Nobel Committee had awarded Curie the Chemie prize before this scandal broke. With the announcement, the pressure of the press was at its peak. Some members in Sweden requested that she not come and fend Morrissey. Marie Curie refused this request. She traveled to Stockholm. Her prize and maintaining assistance Rythen that her private life hat entire sink went. Separate. The true extent remains a mysterium. Exist different views of Valilizvicius regarding the relationship. But one thing is certain. Marie Curie de Science Irk. In Spain, her Soyende Sus of the Dorona of the Perazas. The Prefegers of Zer. The pressures of nationalism and the moral pleasing of public opinion, the relationship with Langevin eventually ended. ended, but the two maintained professional collaboration for many years. This forbidden liaison was not merely the story of a love. It was also a reflection of how a woman scientist's success was perceived as threatening by the society of the time. Marie Curie became a semesri. These symbols frequently concealed her human dimension. The scandal of 1911 was one of those rare moments that reminded people curious, was not only a scientist, but a human being with her own emotions and attachments. Chapter 8. Lanier. Ron Orla. Narration. December 7th and Thaler of our Lord 36. The degrees and branked 13th Brethren's Briais. King Edward the Truce was announcing his abdication. The sentence he's in his address passed into history. I have found it impossible. I find a melody of the Dusterus Endi, and to distort my duties as king, as I wish to do, without the support and help of the woman I love. Wallace was an American worsend of women who had been divorced twice. And these two facts, that she was and had been married twice before, were unacceptable to the British royal family. The Church of England had made its position abundantly clear. Monarchy, clear. Mary Ellen England. Since the Kingland, since were simultaneously considered the supreme government and of the Church of England. Edward Hıstory had ascended to the throne at the beginning 36. But forward moving. George the. But before inheriting the throne, his growing closeness to Wallace Simpson had already begun. A relationship of the Empire of the Kingdom of God news. Within Ubadalu, known renowned, the press, noted in the press, the British press, following the Trentvention, the subject, press. But American and Australian newspapers abreast Frisian Mayors. For years, the government, including Prime Minister Stanley Lennet and Elborton Midden Beltwald Lane, Code Gordon Lang, Alland, told Edward plainly, "You cannot marry marry Wallace Simpson. A compromise path was proposed, a morganatic marriage, which in Simpson would a title of queen, would hold nose in the line of succession. This formulated in some Urim dynasties. But the British Parliament and the Imperial Domingue governments, this formula as well. L. After signing the instrument of abdication on the 10th of December 1936, the Dlia Tirasuka Windsorand in Britain left Britain. In 1937, he married Wallace Simpson. This marriage until their deaths. Edward died, and one died in 1972, in 1972, in 1986. In 1986. But the story had a darker dimension as well, Dokenzer as well. Adil and Duchess of Windsor, as Edward and Wallace Simpson came to be known, visited Nazidid in Nazi Germany, in May 7 and 1970 and at 1937, and met with Hivel. This visit, and certain documents suggesting it Herbert's sympathy for the Naganzurji. And see, Tineur Concinere de Palme du Pays. Among historians, during the war years, the British government appointed Edward governor of the Bahamas, an appointment may have been widely interpreted, had having been made, had the Verkud from the Udusins. This Miri is not merely a tale of sacrifice, it is also of a striking tension between power, obligation, and imperialism, and personal choice. The abjuration astounded the world at the time. Because had learned that British king would renounce the throne for love. Fruta de Cavala, era, Agui el Rivera, the Aga and the Aga Rivera, the anatomy of a turbulent bond a narrand banded narration, Mexico, in the 1920s, was experiencing a great political and cultural transformation. In the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, the country was unfying its identity and interior in deals. Our deals, artistic expression, were intertwined. In this context, Diego Rera his monumental murals, Tuli Ascans fans through a new lens. Frida Kahlo, at the age of 18, sustained injuries in a bus accident that would mark her for the rest of her life. Her spine, pelvis, and multiple bones were shattered. She remained bedridden for many months, and during this period to paint was both therapy, mobbing, paying. She painted self-portraits and canvases built around this identity. This elusive body of work within work came her signature. Kahlo and Rivera met through mutual friends. Rivera was 40th old, had been married twice, and had earned a reputation as a womanizer. Kahlo was 22. They married in 922. They married in 29. Kahlo's family described the bronzed great elephant and a great elephant. This comparison was ironically accurate in both the main character. Throughout their marriage, both had other the pips. Rivera's affair with sister. Rivera's affair with Kahlo's and they divorced in 939. But a year later, they remarried. This cycle contained passion, devotion, all at once. Throughout her worth and her relationship. Among them, both and women, her closeness with Leon Trotsky, which was the Clasiers, and then Tindas at that key was at that time. Trotsky was at that time living in Revere's house as a political refugee. Kahlo's art bore with a stamp all these complex relationships, him suffering, cut hair, open wounds, hearts, spines, ends period in her canvases. These were not mere symbols, but visual language of lived experience. Rivera, both admired her as Ines, as the Fawn, Ravon's wounded, who had profoundly wounded honored her once. This union was forbidden, because the moral values of the era, and the middle-class values of Mexico, absolutely disapproved of relationships so obtuse, so open and multidimensional. But Kahlo and Rivera never pursued that approval. Their story, freedom, pain can coexist. Chapter 10. Our 10, Oscar Wilde and Lord Douglas. Endless Alfred Dord Douglas. Let's Judge Red Dord Triplets. Evaded in the statute and Flirgeness and is in a newsan of the Statuen, loan in 18th century. The laws of Britain punished same-sex relations severely. Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 5 of Glide of 1885 classified acts referred to as gross indecency. Indecency between men as indecency between men as a criminal offense, prescribing a sentence of up to 2 years imprisonment. Laying under the shadow of this law was Oscar Wilde, one of the most brilliant writers of his age. Wilder's plays were winning great success on the West End stage. He was distinguished with laden lines, sharp social criticism, and mastery of language. Works such as The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband, and Lady Windermere's fan were received by Aussiazes with enthusiasm. His novel, The Dorian Gray, had taken its place as a masterpiece posing deep questions about immortality, as in morality. Wilde, Lord Alfred Douglas in 1891 and 1891. 9 Guas. Douglas was a student at Oxford and a young poet. Wilde was 37 years old. The closeness between the two acquired a deep and complex dimension. It was an intellectual, inalike. Douglas's father, Farquhar was aware of the relationship and expressed his great fury in letters he sent to his son. In 1895, Naha 9 Queensberry, left card, at Wilde's club. On this card was Oat, as in a note accusing Wilde of being a sodomite. The word was spelled incorrectly in the English of the time. Despite the insistent warnings of his friends, Wilde Queensberry to court for libel. This decision proved catastrophic. Queensberry's lawyers began assembling evidence and witness an instance, or the defense, and witnesses emerged regarding Wilde's private life. The case reversed. Wilde was arrested on sufficient evidence, tried in separate inquisines in 95 and 195 to tears of hard labor. With hard labor, the years he spent in reading Gaul and the Glulihian, he's during physically and psychologically. He set down the prison experience in the long let owner. Nernst know all the least text. as day history, reckoning with self, and acute and saturated with authors and Richrockley. Douglas. The poem, The Bowanin, as Readingale is counted among the most powers ever written. About what he witnessed for risen. After his release, his friends had lost. He's relived nami. He hifs stambing. He lived, if only a few more years. On the 30th of November, 900, he died in a modest Paris hotel. His converted to Catholicism. The meaning of this step remains debated among historians. Whilst his conviction was not the conviction of an individual alone, the conviction of an era. The law under which same-sex relations were criminalized in force in Britain until 1967 and 2016. In 2017, the Parliament of England and Alls symbolically ordained all men historically convicted under these laws. Application was given the name the Turing Law. Oscar Wilde's name was among those who benefited from this pardon. This was histories of movals, but stories bees. This prohibition was not personal or political. It was legal, and this prohibition, chapterman being Eptherlon the Nisile Toyhille, and polio, and politics, loved, polits, and the ethics, in the heart, at the head of the heart, poet, in the middle of the 15th century. In the 15th century, the Aztec world contained one of the most complex, in all of Mesoamerica. In all of Mesoamerica, the Triple Alliance had been established. The Bennett Stavlakus of Quibland, Panovs Poglen, Tanatobtlind, Takopen. And this structure determined the political balance of the region. The ruler of Texcoco, Nezawalki was one of the most of this era. He entered history, a king, a paying, a poet, and an engineer alike. Nilalfolk. Nezawalkoyanal became the penult. The poems he composed in the Nahuatl language. These poems dressed poems of existence, mortality, the beauty of nature, and the depths of the human spirit. Some are as flower and dew, as flower and song poems. Dozens of his poems, passions of his poems have reached our day, and they occupy a place among the most valued treasures of Aztec Liz of des love of Teridoric, literary heritage, the dimension of forbidden love, of dans santing sneeps, Berts and Reorts, is stored in Wakuyils. Historical says record that he had many wives and concubines. But the most dramatic narrative derivative concerns his attraction to Bulewuming Belomen Dulonga Zawils. Nobles. This relationship shook. Thus Balith Baled Andis, the abandoned to his fate, the errative Verus. The narrative differs from source to source, but at the heart of this story lie both love, passion, a face, April passion, and a political reckoning. Niza Hualcoyatl was whose figure, who sought to reconcile an artistic spirit with the reality of being compelled to govern a state. In his poems, we can feel this tension. He speaks from a place somewhere between wonder, the meaninglessness of the universe, and the wearied Evsire. Reading everyday exercises of power. Perhaps forbidden love, expression of against and against. Against is old person, it is in which a souled pole. It was so that Poe's poetry was Lorsporst. The written sources, Aztecs is as of Aztec civilization, were largely destroyed in the aftermath of the Sponquest. The Spanish conquest. Thus, this much of what we know about Nisa Walkiedl's private life, rests Rissen Sun in Spanish. In the 16th, on poems preserves in Nalos, in the Nahua language. This uncertainty does not make the less real. On the contrary, it reminds us knowledge how frail is knowledgeable, and what kinds of choices shape historical memory. Chapter 12. Josephine and Napoleon. Bent. Tuin, between Triamans, Antvelase, and Trinalice, and Sonalnician Napoleon apart is one of the most figures in history. But his most personal dimension is hidden in Provisorreichings. With the Luntz, Dubabo are nice. This relationship contain months, passion, betrayal, political calculation, and a broken heart. Trying to survive amid the chaos of the French Revolution as the widow of a noble family. Her first husband, Alexander, had the Lustanis in Efried as any Ruv. His nephew, Brevine, Brifliner Saints, briefly, When she regained her saint fightem and fun sethen 5, none and night 5, she was a known figure, Prusen. First Napoleon. In this period, Napoleon fell in love with her. This is a referent from his correspondence. The letters he wrote, flirt de gach, Saban, the ordinary genius, the lay, genius. The play Foris who loves deeply. During his long canes he wrote Spains, he wrote ex longing, ash resra, to her, his attire of her, his desire to be reunited with an open-heartedness, that was as his alone, was if he lies alone. Josephine replies, va more, va, she, these letters, far more coolly, frequently lately. They made him late 1889 entire Tivern. 7 or reign sick 96. 796. But the marriage was symmetric from the Napoleon was passionately bound amps. Josephine did not entirely reciprocate this feeling. During Napoleon's long campaigns, Josephine utamed Holy Charlottes. When surnamed Hippolyte Charles, Napoleon was shaken when he learned of a liaison son. He continued to hold Josephine. As the years passed, the nature of the relationship changed. When Napoleon became emperor, a male heir was needed for Thithniad Phenophyta Uashti, Azisi. Gosvofin ger ehad, Tubuaren, Schillenbrunde Poldren, occurs two marriages. 1809. In 1809, Napoleon divorced Josephine. This decision was difficult. The circumstances at the divorce ceremony. The Folienlep. He married Archduchess son and had a son. But Napoleon never fully severed his bond with Josephine. When Josephine died, Ingvrid Inoleen's response from his exile on Elba was a sign of profound grief. The emotion he expressed was not merely the sorrow of a former spouse. It was the loss of what had been one of the deepest bonds of his life. It is life. It is recorded that among Napoleon's last words, bed, Josephine's name was spoken. Yet, the historic anecdote remains debated. Nevertheless, the tense, unequal, yet real bond bond, but these two people continues to be one of history's most relationships. Alleged relationships. This story was nerbevan. The marriage was legal, lit. But the asymmetry, the balance between power and love, the balance between power and love, between between poesant collision and personal revolution, makes it the story of a different kind of prohibition. The prohibition here was perhaps being full of loved and or Bethy, full on loved, draw around themselves. And the love, there bide in love, and if truth, the truth is in our retcher in this dialectically, that too a bit. Stories, different ages, different gerund, different ephras, but in all of them there was one thing in common. Bina e Dindar, laws, Oz, of their time. This bond sometimes shook empire, sometimes shook foundations of a relations of a religious institution, and hence concept of forbidden love, viewed from the surface, appears to be a romantic defiance. A romantic defiance. But deep within history, behind every livery prohibition, lies a conqueror of power. The eth of the church, class division, ethnic origin. The legal oppression built upon consensual identity, continuity of dynasties, Oris, the anonymity of tribes toward one another. What is forbidden is always that threatens the current society. Is this orders the prohibition of one century may become the commonplace of the next. The law amidst the underwater which Oscar Wilde was imprisoned was repealed. The tradition broken by Hurrem Sultan gave rise to a new tradition. The alliances built by Cleopatra shaped Rome's of the world. Murray Curie, despite the entire scandal, received the Nobel Prize and continues to be one of the most infamous since the history of science. But some forbidden us. Never and hap ner mead hey do you see. Countless nameless bulls lived invisibly in the shadow of their era's rules, and vanished What we narrated and in this documentary were stories, Presoria, by Kular Dalish, Documents by documents, dit related by palili, or by literature. History carries of the powerful sounds more loudly, narratives, the bearing lives the stamp of written culture live longer, but in every society, in every inner area. Sure, there were people who loved in spite of prohibition. These people, all likelihood, were defeated most of the time, but they continued to exist. This insistent quality, the human heart, is used for universal truth. Walls were built, walls were torn down, laws were written, laws were changed, but loving, inevitable, this dangerous, this resilient act was never entirely suppressed. These are the suppressed. These are the stories of loves that were forbidden in history. But they are also the stories, what it means to be human, and perhaps, for precisely this reason, worth telling centuries later.